Kia ora koutou. Ngā mihi koutou. I'm Alina Siegfried, and welcome to this webisode on building farm resilience as part of the Our Regenerative Future series. Wonderful to have you here. Again, my name is Alina. I'm the author of the Our Regenerative Future series, produced in partnership with Pure Advantage and Edmund Hillary Fellowship. And over the past 6 months or so, I've taken a deep dive into the world of regenerative agriculture. It started out as an idea to write a few stories about carbon sequestration and some of the farmers that were employing regenerative methods on their farms, and snowballed quite quickly into a 15-part content series published on Pure Advantage and Edmund Hillary Fellowship's blog on Medium, and has spun out 6 or 7 actually webinars by now. So we launched a series of 6 to begin with, and found that the conversation and dialogue around regenerative agriculture and regenerative economy in general was such that we decided to launch another 6 webinars. So this is number 2 of that second series. And in the next few weeks, we'll be just looking at themes like regenerative forestry, regenerative tourism, and urban agriculture as well. And the recognition that it's not all upon farmers to be solving our climate change and other environmental woes, and that we all have a part to play in creating a more regenerative and sustainable economy for New Zealand, and bringing about the kind of systems-level strategies that we need to go into the future. So today we are on the farm, and we are discussing farm resilience in all its forms with 2 wonderful panelists, which I'll introduce to you quickly. Greg Hart, along with his wife Rachel, is transitioning their traditional sheep and cattle farm station into a farm with regenerative farming systems. So they're restoring, planting trees, sequestering carbon, and building healthy soil. Mangarara Station near Ellsthorpe in the Hawke's Bay is also known as the Family Farm, and it's a 610 hectare property that's an open to public living example of regenerative agriculture, which is really neat. They've got an eco lodge there so you can go and see what's going on. Greg has a Bachelor of Agriculture from Massey and has previously worked in agribusiness consultancy, livestock export and grain marketing. Gary Williams is a water and soil engineer, a biodynamic farmer, permaculture activist and teacher, and a natural philosopher. He's the author of several books, and along with his partner Emily, has been living on a small farm where they run a diverse array of farming and forestry activities, from home gardens, orchards, staple crops, animal grazing, firewood and plantation forests, and wilderness teaching. So he's a long-time guru in this space. Wonderful to have you both on the panel today. I see that everybody seems to have voted in our poll, which is fantastic. Thank you. We've got a good mix of people on the call today. So 36% farmers and growers, which is a little lower than we usually have, but we've got others from science and academia, business, media, and other. So it's fantastic to see such a wonderfully diverse group here today. Looks like most people have read at least some of Our Regenerative Future stories, which is fantastic. So we've got a good grounding of what the series is about. And again, most people are somewhat familiar with regenerative agriculture, or very familiar. That's fantastic. So I think we can start this conversation at a pretty high level. I think now I would love to introduce, or rather let our 2 panelists introduce themselves, and invite them to perhaps weave into your introduction what farm resilience actually means to you. Let's start with you, Gary.
Okay, thank you, Alina. I suppose in terms of our background on the property we have here, which is quite a small farm, it's mainly a hill, and so most of it's gone to forest. Well, it was mostly in pasture when we came here. It's now largely in forest. And I mean, it was a huge learning exercise for us, and I like to sort of say that to people, that when you make mistakes, that's good, because that's how you learn. You only learn by doing things and then trying to work out what happened, because a mistake is just sort of happening which you can learn from, and it's really, that's what really important. And I think in terms of regenerative type of agriculture, whatever you want to call it, you're going to be on a learning curve. You're going to be transitioning to something quite different. That's really important that you make mistakes, because that's what resilience is going to be about, really, learning from your mistakes. But I think you've sort of done a brief introduction of where I'm coming from, but I'd actually just like to talk a little wider about resilience, because to me, it's not something in itself. It's in context with what's a healthy ecosystem. So there's a balance between productivity and resilience, and there's a constant sort of interchange goes on that maintains both productivity and resilience, which is like repair and protection of the system under either internal or external threats or hazards that come along. So I'd like to actually start not with agriculture, but with ourselves. I think it's maybe easy to understand resilience in that way, because we're an ecosystem, right? We're a living, breathing ecosystem. And when we take in food, some of that food is for energy and vitality to do work and that, right? So we take in food, we actually burn it. We burn carbs with oxygen, which we breathe in. And it's like burning in an engine as well. You actually burn and you cause damage by burning. And so the system has to repair itself constantly. And so there's this sort of balance going on. And so some of the food is sort of straight carbs, easy energy, sugars, some of it's fats, slower burning, longer term energy. But all of that causes damage to our systems, to our cells, to our system. So then we talk about antioxidants, right? And micronutrients that come in to do all the complicated repair, balancing, protection systems required to allow the body to remain healthy. So to me, we're healthy when we have the right balance between productivity or energy for work and repair, protection type of resilience. And the tricky part of it is how our body knows when to repair what, with what and how. And it's highly complicated, and it's a very diverse system. And the response has to be what I think is a really important word: in proportion. It's just be proportional to the issue or the problem, what's going on. And to give an example of that, the body sometimes overreacts, and you get lots of inflammation all around the body, like maybe it's happening with this coronavirus actually. And that's an overreaction. It's not in proportion, and that's dangerous. So the question is, how do we maintain proportionality? How do we get the right information? So again, resilience to me comes from highly interconnected systems which provide information which allows proportionate action. So if you come to agriculture, and perhaps I will start with a more horticultural one, you need a lot of diversity, which is well connected. I mean, diversity in itself just doesn't work. You can throw a whole lot of stuff there. That doesn't work. It's got to be well connected. It's got to have the right feedback systems, and it's got to make appropriate responses. And to try and do that with our small brains ourselves in a management way is really, really difficult. So to me, regenerating or regenerative agriculture is about nature doing all that work, because she knows how to do it. She's been doing it for millions of years. And we just come in as a small amount of energy, a small amount of management that maybe then allows us to take some resources from that system, and we give back by our actions and our intelligence. Because when you're trying to get a resilient system by putting that in there to kill that weed, or putting that in there to kill that bug, or putting that in there to give a bit of nutrient, just about all the time you're going to be in wrong proportions, and the system's not going to work well. And that's why I think our industrial agriculture is so lacking in resilience. It's so fragile for that reason. And that's why I see going over to something that is based on nature doing most of the work, and thank you very much, and getting things right and repairing things as it's required, then we're going to be much better off. So that would be my take on resilience.
Thank you, Gary. Yeah, certainly a delicate balance to be managing out there on the farm. Greg, over to you. Greg, have we got you on the line here?
Just, yeah, thanks,
Just,
Alina. Yeah. And kia ora, everybody. I am on one of our classic rural dodgy broadband connections, and so I might come and go a bit and miss a little bit. But yeah, it's great to be here today, and resilience is really probably what put us on our path in changing the way we were farming and managing Mangurara. And that journey began about 20 years ago, and at the time, I guess we were thinking about the future, and it was having our first child, and thinking about the world that they were going to inherit. And then I guess at that time, you know, sustainability was kind of in our thoughts, and understanding that pastoral agriculture in New Zealand is based upon bringing, you know, nutrients from the other side of the world to keep our fertilizers on our pastures and keep the system growing. And so that didn't seem a long-term sort of sustainable option for us, and especially when we consider the amount of energy involved with that and finite resources. And so that's sent us off on this very long journey, which I'm sure is going to last the whole of my life. And it has evolved over, I guess, the last 10 years or so, of the awareness of the word regenerative agriculture. And we don't get hung up on the words or the labels that we give it, but it is about the philosophy and the approach of working with nature, looking and learning from nature. And part of that also of regenerative agriculture is about building resilience into your system. And for us, you know, that does start with the soil, and it's also been about building a whole lot of diversity into our system, which has been not just adding a whole lot of trees and creating that space for nature, as well as, you know, different production systems, which leads to different income streams. But also it's been about, you know, creating diverse sort of, you know, all the visitors that we get to our farm, and a whole lot of energy that sort of fuels us and keeps us going. And like Gary mentioned, I do think, you know, we can't leave out our personal resilience from this, and I think that has been a big part of, you know, the journey on the farm, because ultimately I think as we go through life and hopefully learn a few things along the way, we continue to evolve and deepen our understanding of what we're on this planet to do. And I think, you know, that starts to be reflected in the landscapes around us, and hopefully, you know, there's our landscapes are a lot diverse, and hopefully, you know, beauty is a big part of what we do here. And so I think, you know, that's been a personal journey. And resilience also, as we've seen in Hawke's Bay this year, going through the drought, and I guess, you know, with COVID and everything, is community resilience, which has been really important too. And just acknowledging, you know, that role of kindness and compassion, and for people to support and look out for each other. So it is very broad, but yeah, it's all connected.
Right. We are experiencing a little bit of distortion with your video, Greg. I'm thinking we might just turn off your video so the audio is coming through nice and clear, if you're okay with that. Would love to be able to hear what you're saying. Yeah. Yeah, I think in both of your answers there, you really touched quite a lot on resilience beyond just thinking about the environment. And that's something that often conversations around farm resilience are around the environmental factors, so resilience from pests, from extreme weather events, from the sorts of droughts that we've seen this summer in the North Island. So, Greg, I wonder if you could speak a little bit more to that community or emotional or social resilience that you think regenerative farming can help facilitate.
Yeah, thanks. Just, I guess also, you know, as a view of resilience, you know, it is about our landscapes and the appropriate land use for the different land classes. And there also, it's the ability of meeting, you know, the challenges that are just part of life, and but I guess the ones that we don't expect every day. And so it's just about not just bouncing back from those challenges that we face, but it's about bouncing forward so that we continue to evolve and adapt and you know, become more resilient to the challenges that the future undoubtedly holds. And I guess, you know, on a community level, you know, again, we have had, you know, Poppy Renton has become a bit of a hero in Hawke's Bay, starting a Facebook page, which has given us the ability to connect as farmers and support and just share stories, and just, you know, especially people on farms, to know that you're not alone out there, and that there are others in the same boat. And I guess it was especially hard through COVID because the pubs were closed and we couldn't just you know, pop down and have a yarn with all your mates over that time. So, you know, it was important to be able to connect and communicate and have that support.
Yeah, absolutely. It's wonderful to see the farmers going online too, as well as all us city folk who are working from our home offices. Gary, did you have anything you wanted to add around social and community resilience? I know you've been working in this space a long time.
Yeah, well, the whole idea of growing food is to feed people, and it's not, well, it shouldn't be somebody doing one part of it and the other people are at the end of some system and just buying in the supermarket. I mean, I think it's really important. There's not many community supported sort of agricultural sort of systems in New Zealand. There's one or two. It's very prevalent in North America in particular. But there are different ways in which we can connect people between you know, urban and rural and everything in between. I think that's what's really important. I think for any food system to be resilient requires, again, good connectivity, and that means human connectivity as much as, you know, we tend to think of it as just something to do with nature. Well, we're nature too, and we have to connect with each other, and we have to support each other, and we have to find ways of feeding back information which is appropriate and helpful. And I have to say, I mean, I come from a farming background. My parents were farmers, and I still have a lot of family of farmers and that, and so my wife's the same. A lot of the feedback's not always helpful because it's not aimed at trying to help with appropriate action that should be taken. And so I think it's really important that people do relate to their food and try to understand it more, trying to what's behind that food, what's the effect on both people and our wider environment from our farming methods, and how can we help everybody in the system to be healthier. And you can come back to, you know, to health, because I mean, a well-functioning ecosystem is, we can call it healthy. So our food supply system needs to be healthy in terms of right through. And of course, the problem is at the moment it's not. It's very unhealthy in its sort of very linear connections, long distance transport, poor feedback between the people along the chain. So very much the sort of, when I was with people trying to promote organics and that, it was very much about people understanding where the food came from, how they can be involved with it. So it's actually, you know, it's just as vital, that part of the system, as what happens on the farm.
Yeah, I love it.
Yeah.
Healthy food, healthy people, healthy communities. Yeah. Greg, did you want to add something there?
Yeah. Just, I'd agree with that too, because I mean, it's been a big part of our journey is connecting people back with the farm. And I think that loss of connection is one of the biggest issues that results in, you know, the challenges, whether it be climate change or social issues and health issues out there, is just that loss of connection with understanding how food is grown, where it's coming from, and that. And so that's a big part of this, is educating and connecting people back to the land, so they can make more informed choices. And that whole thing about understanding that every dollar they spend on food is a vote for the kind of future we're going to have. So yeah, connecting people back to the land and farms is really important.
Thanks, Greg. I'd love to hear a little bit about your experience this summer. You, of course, are in Hawke's Bay, where there was a pretty brutal drought. Can you speak a little bit as to how it was in the Hawke's Bay and how you dealt with that on your property?
Yeah, we gear up like most Hawke's Bay farmers for dry summers, but I guess the way we do this a little bit differently is by having higher pasture covers and using holistic grazing management. So we do take more grass into the summer, so we've kind of got a hay shed full of grass already on our farm, which we can graze down through that summer. And that is all about taller grasses with deeper root systems going into the ground, so accessing water deeper deeper in the soil profile. And also we're always wanting to keep the soil covered with our holistic grazing, and so the soil is never exposed to the sun and drying it out. And then we have longer rest periods, so while we don't graze it right to the ground through that summer initially, and give it a longer rest period so that it can recover. And so we did have good pasture and plenty of feed for our animals right through the summer. Where we sort of get a little bit where it got tough for us is when we don't get rain in April and May, and because you kind of expect it to be raining there. And so we got through the summer perfectly okay, and but we have had to reduce our stock numbers going into this winter. But again, grass grows grass, and our pasture covers have bounced back really well, and so we're in a position basically now to restock the farm. And we have saved ourselves a lot of stress through this time, because it has been really hard for a lot of farmers. And there's been farmers that have been feeding out to their stock since February, and and that's tough, and it's really expensive. We haven't bought any feed, and we haven't applied any nitrogen, but we're still farming very profitably. And each day at the moment I'm going out and shifting my animals, and they're going into pastures almost up to their knees, and they're well fed. And the other really big benefit of just this approach is for the mental well-being and welfare of the farmers, and it does take a lot of stress off. And because we all love to see our animals healthy and doing well and being well fed. And so we've been able to do that, which has been really cool.
Yeah, that's great. It's great to see a sort of a cascading series of effects there. If you've got a resilient farm, then the animals are more healthy, the farmers are faring better in terms of stress. And really interesting to hear how those kind of regenerative methods can be helping retain the water. I know we spoke last week with Jeff Check from the Rodale Institute, who of course are a global leader on regenerative agriculture. And I think they've been running a 40-year study, I think, talking about, or one of the findings is how in drought years, the organic crops tend to fare a lot better than conventional ones. So I'd love to ask a question now, which has come from Barbara Hay, and refers to a Dominion Post article this morning, actually, a story called "Fertilizers Are Vital." So perhaps this is a question for Gary, but that there are the article says there are misconceptions around soil health and regenerative agriculture, namely that fertilizer is counterproductive to both. This just isn't true. This is a quote. Most New Zealand soils, for example, are naturally poor in phosphorus. Your thoughts on that, Gary?
Well, yeah, that's probably a big question, isn't it? I mean, they're actually not poor in phosphorus, or poor in available phosphorus more, actually. But, and sometimes these details are important. Yeah, well, it goes right back to the heart of the system you're trying to do in terms of fertilizer. I mean, systems obviously work well by themselves. In nature they have for, we've come along and we've changed the approach. And particularly the problem with artificial synthetic fertilizers is it actually suppresses natural fertility of the system, because it actually reduces the soil life and the structure of your soils. It gets affected and it doesn't regenerate properly. I mean, going on from what Greg said in terms of like, if you've got a system of that type of grazing he talks about, then you've got more soil life, you've got better moisture holding capacity. The whole system is got much more, capacity to last through events like droughts or whatever it is, or storms as well, because you've got the cover on that. So the problem with the artificial fertilizers is it dumbs down the whole natural system and makes it much more fragile. So of course you're stuck with it. Then you've got no reserves, so you have to keep applying it. And then because the soil life is not active and it's not really a balanced system, then you get pest problems, might come in, grass scrub things might come in, or whatever might come infect your pastures or your crops or whatever. And so you just get into the vicious cycle of more and more fertilizer, and then more and more pesticides and herbicides and all sorts of other things that are going on that just spiral you into it. So yeah, you can keep doing that if you can keep getting hold of the fertilizers, if you keep got all that oil, all that to run all those machineries to do it all. No, you can do it, but at some point we've got to get off that. We've got to get back to much more using the natural fertility there and generate more natural fertility, so that then we can get a surplus for ourselves from that. And the biggest issue to me is I suppose the most problematic agriculture to me, put it this way, is what requires tilling because of our annuals, and that's basically vegetables and arable crops. They're annual crops. They need to be replanted every year. You need to do something to prepare the soil for it, and then you've got to look at the competition that comes from that prepared bare soil, which we call weeds or whatever it is. So you get into really a vicious cycle. And so to put my cards on the table, I'm much more in favour or sympathetic to perennial systems. When you talk about perennials, most people think about trees and horticulture and that, but what Greg's talk about is a perennial system involving grasslands and large animals, grazing, recycling the nutrients, building up the soil carbon, etc., and it does it without having to till the soil, without taking off the cover, right? So our most problematic agriculture to me is our staples, our wheat and oats, and our veggies, and the way it's grown in the industrial system. And if people knew what was put on those veggies when they were grown, I live in the Horowhenua. I could take you to places where they pour on toxic chemicals, one after the other, and artificial fertilizers. Now that grows a type of vegetable, but how good is that vegetable for you? It comes out of a very unhealthy environment to me, and it's not that good in terms of keeping us healthy. So I think the people who talk about say, oh yeah, no, our soils are okay and we can keep applying fertilizer, need to step back and say, well, what are we trying to do here? What sort of food are we trying to grow? What's the quality of that food in terms of its vitality and that. So personally, I mean, I've heard this argument, this thing so many times, I sort of put it to one side and I said, look, you do your own thing, you do your industrial agriculture. Let's get on with the people who want to get on with growing food well and in a way that gives you good natural fertility and vitality.
Yes, I think that's an interesting point there around investigating where the benchmark is, that people keep pointing out that New Zealand has world-leading agricultural systems, and we certainly do a lot of things well, but we still do them in a very unnatural way compared to how nature would be managing a system. You made a good point there around fossil fuels and farm in an uncertain future in terms of fossil fuels. And Greg, I know that you talked about that quite a lot in your article in terms of reducing reliance on on imports from outside of the country, and particularly in this time of global pandemic, and the realization that this could be something that's in our future as waves of these sorts of global shocks. Can you speak a little bit to the ceasing reliance so much on fossil fuels on your property?
Absolutely, but just also like to cover off that question about fertilizer, because it is key and it is fascinating, and I can't answer it, but I was involved with a forum, the Better Futures Forum, and sort of putting in some feedback to what that group is doing at the moment. And of course, the issue of fertilizer arises, and the reality is that the current system is not sustainable, and so therefore we have to look at alternatives, and that's what set us off down this path. And like Gary said, we are focusing on perennial production and creating those natural nutrient cycles as much as possible, and returning as much back to the soil as we can. And ideally, as far as our sheep and beef production on this farm, then I'd love to have a local abattoir, and where we can compost the waste that doesn't get eaten by humans, not the waste, but the materials that are not consumed by humans back into the farm system. It'd be great to get the bones back, because I think my understanding is that the phosphorus that we lose from our system is largely in the bones of the animals, and so again there's ways of composting them, burning them back, and reapplying it back to the soil. And again, I'm not an expert on this, but I've heard people talk about peak water, peak oil, and these challenges we face, and peak phosphate is possibly another one that's right up there this century. And so we do have to recycle as much as we can and keep it on our properties. But I think we're going to have to look at an opportunity, and Gary will appreciate permaculture thinking is the problem is the solution. And I know our local councils are having issue with their sewage ponds and that at the moment, but if that could be processed like it is in some countries around the world, and again replied back into our nutrient cycles. And I guess the other really big opportunity at the moment is through harvesting seaweed, and perhaps capturing some of those nutrients that end in the ocean and getting them back onto our land as well. So that's cool. And with the getting rid of the fossil fuels, we haven't gone down the track of those beautiful sunflowers that are in that picture behind you, Alina, and done those diverse crops. And just because I guess we were looking a little bit further ahead, and there's a lot of energy involved with cultivating and harvesting all those seeds and bringing them from all around the country and getting them in. And I do appreciate at the moment that guys doing that are getting amazing results, and we've got the energy, and so you may as well do that, because they're getting some really great responses and benefits to their soil. And but we're trying to get that diversity through our grazing management, and also through planting trees. And I think the really big opportunity that we are missing at the moment in New Zealand is through silvopasture and agroforestry, and including trees into our landscape with grazing animals, and a whole integrated system, where there is a lot of opportunity at the moment through carbon schemes to get extra income from the land by clipping the carbon ticket while it's here. But again, through diversity, we are also going to be creating a bit of stock fodder for animals through drought periods. We can include some fruit and nut trees in our lines of trees that we're planting in our pastures, and it's just creating that whole biodiversity, which we just had a young fella just started working for us today, and we're out shifting cattle, and hadn't seen, whenever we shift cattle, we just get this big flock of birds come around our place. And because the grass is longer, the insects have had more time to breed, and so as you put cattle into new pasture every day, they obviously kicking up a few insects, and it's a feast for birds. And again, that's, I think, part of starting these natural cycles, and back to those natural nutrient cycles, the manure from those birds that's going into the system, and the insects, and we're just connecting it all up again, and reconnecting a lot of those natural cycles.
Yeah, the trees are an interesting one and super important. And I think it was Kay Baxter who made the point in her article that the trees can often access the stores of phosphate that are much deeper down that pastures or other diverse pastoral plants can't get to.
Absolutely. And there's also the animal welfare issues too. You know, if we are to, you know, our export markets are we want to be the best of the best, and our animal welfare has to be right up there. And so I think it's important, especially, you know, in hot, dry Hawke's Bay, that there's shade and shelter for our animals. So it ticks all the boxes. And you know, while there's, you know, opportunities through different council incentives and billion trees, well, not so much billion trees, unfortunately, that's all about, you know, there is opportunities to get native plantings on the farm, but so much of it is just, you know, blanket planting of trees. But there is this opportunity of sequestering the carbon and continuing to produce food as we do it, and increasing the income that we're earning off the land at the same time, and also building that resilience, stopping wind, putting shade, and so yeah, that's a real opportunity.
Yeah, there's a big question there about what sort of trees we're planting, isn't there? Next week at 7 o'clock next Monday, we have got an episode on regenerative forestry, and we'll be speaking in that one with Dame Anne Salmond, Dr. David Hall, and Ramona Radford, who's coming at it from a Te Ao Māori perspective in terms of forest regeneration. So that's going to be a super exciting, high-octane webinar, I think. Some amazing people on that panel as well. But Greg, I'd love to hear a little bit from you about how you're approaching the mix of different trees you're planting on your farm. And then Gary, I'd love to circle back to you with a related question as well. But Greg, if you want to comment on that first.
Yeah, so I guess, you know, we're very fortunate that we formed a partnership with Air New Zealand 10 years ago, because I don't think we'd be forming one just at the moment. But that has enabled us to identify some of the steeper, more erosion-prone land on our farm, and so with that community support or support from in New Zealand, we've planted areas that have been, you know, livestock are excluded, and that is just for nature and regeneration. So we've identified those parts of the land, and obviously, you know, waterways are all fenced off and planted, and then there is the matter of just integrating trees through the pastoral system, and again, you know, taking our learnings from nature. Diversity is the key, and so we've planted, you know, many kinds of trees through the pasture, and that's an area that we're going to keep expanding on. So yeah, and of course, so it's just matching right tree, right places as our first part of that decision-making process. Thanks,
Greg. Gary, I want to put to you a question that came through in the registration from somebody when they signed up for this webinar. But can you speak to any implications of the over-reliance on fast-growing non-natives such as poplar and willow on farms?
Okay, Lena, if I can just back up slightly with what Greg said, because I'm sort of yes to everything he's saying there, and just comment I'd like to make is that, you know, trees are nutrient accumulators, and they accumulate within the soil, and then the groundwater will take those nutrients across the land. And so how you have trees on a landscape is really important in terms of accumulating and feeding maybe your pastoral areas or your vegetable growing areas or whatever. There's a whole interconnection in the landscape in terms of where you put trees, and the benefits like what Greg talked about with the shade and the shelter and all that, but the nutrient accumulation is really important. And so there has to be a sort of an accumulative side as well as a sort of a take side. So there's a give and take. So you do take nutrients off the farm, but you can also accumulate them on the farm by doing things with trees. And just, I'd like to touch on the other point you made about birds, because birds are great spreaders of nutrients, and seabirds in particular. And I was going to say we have, or it's more like had, huge amounts of seabirds in New Zealand. And that was one of the main ways that the nutrients from the sea get recycled back to the land, is by seabirds. Unfortunately, a lot of our seabirds are declining in numbers quite drastically. So we're losing that recycling ability of birds, particularly nutrients from the sea back to the land. So that said, then what's the role of different trees is a really interesting question. And a lot of it comes down to speed, I suppose, timing. It's like, if you want to sequester carbon, for instance, actually the quickest way is what Greg's doing, because grasslands and animals will sequester it more quickly. They won't sequester it as much as trees and forests will in the end. So in the end, a forest, particularly in its growth phase, will sequester a lot of carbon, and then even in its mature phase, will certainly hold that carbon and recycle it. So a lot of the trees that we grow, like poplars for soil conservation purposes on hill country, because they grow fast and they have deep roots and they help to stabilize the land more quickly. And so the same with, I'm well aware of from my professional work on rivers that we use willows along river edges because they grow fast, they actually accumulate, take out too much nutrients from rivers very quickly, and they can be managed to very easily to try and reduce erosions, etc., etc., etc. So that's why they're used. If you're going to use a wider range of trees, then the first thing you'd have to do, for instance, along rivers, if I can go on that one, is give them a lot more room, the river more space, have much wider berms and much more extent of vegetation along them. It's a bit the same in agriculture as well. That, I mean, I think you can use willows as an initial uptake of nutrients when you've got excessive nutrient loads, and that's true of quite a lot of our wetlands and waterways. But then they're a great nurse crop for natives as well. Natives will come through willows very, very easily, and particularly the birds come in, they eat the buds, they poop, they drop the seed, the natives can come through, all sorts of reasons why. So to me, I don't think it's an either or. And if we started talking about horticulture, well, it's even more difficult because virtually all our horticultural crops, even diverse food forest ones, come from other ecosystems outside New Zealand. And we put together trees from all different ecosystems, put them together, and think, well, you know, how are they going to grow as a sort of a well-functioning ecosystem now with all these different ones coming from different places. And so there's a whole question around there that I haven't got time to go into, but to me it's from a permaculture perspective. I say, well, what's there, what works well, and how can we progress it, or what succession can we have? I don't think it's an either or. It's a matter of it's a matter of diversity of thinking and diversity of action, and we can't sort of suddenly jump from one thing to another, or if we do, we're going to have lots of consequences. So it's a question that's a very good question, but it's a very long answer. I haven't got time to go much further. Sorry.
It's okay. We've got plenty of things to explore on this webinar, and the questions that we don't get to, we'll try and address some of those on the Pure Advantage social media in the coming weeks, so we can keep this conversation going. There's a little bit of debate going on here in the Q&A around the role of cattle, with a question or somebody pointing out that Dr. Paul Winton has been in Gisborne on a speaking tour around climate change, and one of his major messages to decarbonise is to phase out cattle farming and plant many more trees, mainly pine. So I think we've debated that one a little bit, and we'll be absolutely diving into the pine versus natives more next week. But what are your takes on phasing out ruminants as far as regenerative agriculture goes? I know there's been a lot of discussion around this and the role of a whole systems approach. So Greg, perhaps we'll start with you, and then we'll hear your take on it, Gary.
Yeah, my understanding, and you know, this is an area that needs more work, and so you know, looking at white pastures white oak pastures in America, who have done that analysis, looking at their cattle production and what that's doing to greenhouse gases, and comparing it with the Impossible Burger type, you know, vegetarian diet. And you know, I think part of regenerative agriculture, and it is a paradigm shift, is the understanding that humans and our systems that we are managing can be part of healing and doing good on the planet, as opposed to a lot of discussion which is about just doing less bad. And so, you know, from that study and a lot of work that is underway now, and understanding that pastoral grazing systems with ruminants are going to be sequestering more carbon than they are emitting. I was listening to a web podcast yesterday. It's called The Regenerative Agriculture Journey out of Australia, and they're doing some interesting research at the moment, and research indicating that by feeding seaweeds, and the enzymes in the seaweed can reduce methane from animals by 90%. And so when you add, you know, diverse pastures and that, I think, you know, again, you know, there's reduced amounts of methane coming there. I don't think we fully understand the role of methanotrophic bacteria in the soils and their ability to sequester methane. And so, I mean, you know, sheep and beef farming in New Zealand, we're already 30% below what our greenhouse gas emissions were in 1990. So, you know, that is part of a natural cycle, and it's an essential part, as Gary said, you know, harvesting that fast growing grasses and completing those carbon cycles going needs animals as part of that. And so, you know, and there's the whole, you know, fertility role that they have and the nutrients that they are returning back to the ground and all the microbiology associated with that. And so I think that I don't believe that yeah, we should be removing animals, and particularly ruminants and cattle, from our food system. I think it's an essential part of it, but incorporating trees and incorporating the whole lot.
Thanks, Greg. Anything you'd like to add to that, Gary?
Yeah, well, my comment would be it's not what you're doing, it's how you're doing it, which is really important. And it depends. We keep saying in permaculture, it depends. Depends on the place, depends on the climate, depends on the landscape. There's certain areas where you can really grow trees really well, and certain areas which are grasslands. Grasslands with large animals are part of the ecosystems of the world. You know, we can manage them well, or we manage them very poorly. Because we're very poorly managing pastoral animal farming, doesn't mean to say it has no place anywhere in the world, or that we can't do it well, like what Greg is saying. So it's much more about how do we go about doing it, because it's all very well saying we'll put it all in the forest. And I'll come back to the point I made, that how veggies are growing and that sort of thing, and that's probably the most destructive type of industrial agriculture in terms of what's doing to the soils and the local environment. And so it's, yeah, I mean, we can sequester carbon in all sorts of different ways, and it comes back to diversity again. It's how as I said earlier, how the trees are in the landscape, along with what grasslands, along with what might be done with some of the vegetables and that. And you can grow veggies along the edges of forests really easily. That's where a lot of them come from. It's just that we don't do that. And to sort of say, they take this sort of blanket thing, no, we've just got to get out of ruminants. I mean, it's like, well, okay, then we should just get out of the type of market gardening we're doing now, because, man, that's so destructive. And when you talk about methane, I mean, it's how it gets recycled that's the issue, not that producing methane. The places that produce the most methane are tropical rainforests. They produce huge amounts of methane, far more than a pastoral farm will do, but it gets recycled within the system. Wetlands are great for producing methane, that's what they do. There's a breakdown system where they produce methane. And we get hung up on sort of the methane we measure. somewhere on the farm, and we don't consider the methane we don't measure in our wetlands and forests, and we somehow think the methane on the farm is bad and the methane in the forest, well, we just ignored that. You know, I just don't think our accounting is very good at all, frankly. So, and that's why again, the feedback information is not appropriate, and so we keep making, in my opinion, the wrong choices. And unless we get the information, you know, a little bit more nuanced and a little bit more accurate, then I think we'll keep making these sort of broad statements about has to be like this, has to be like that. That's the problem with our culture. It's just like, it's, okay, we got a problem, find a solution. That's the solution, just do that. We don't think about connections. We don't think about consequences. We don't think about the whole interaction that's going to take place from that particular action. And that's what we need to do. We need to think about what are all the consequences? What are all the ramifications that are going to take place from doing that? Right? Socially, economically, environmentally, yeah, culturally too. Right?
Yeah, I think herein lies the problem with our predominant reductionist scientific inquiry to measure all these small parts of an inherently complex system. We have a few more minutes here, and there's been a couple of comments around bees. So I'd just love to talk a little bit about bees and pollination, and Barry Foster's pointed people here towards the Trees for Bees website and incorporating important sources of pollen and nectar. But there's a question that came through with the registrations that I'd love to ask you, Gary. What do you know about pollination security and threats such as the fallen economics of beekeeping?
Well, I used to do beekeeping myself before the Variamite came in. It was very difficult to do it without chemicals, but only on a small scale. And I'm no expert on those pollination questions, really. I mean, I just do note, though, that our insects are in huge decline, not just bees. And that's clearly because of, in my opinion, all the toxins that are spread around our landscape, and insects get particularly affected, as the soil life. So we have a wider issue, I think, than just, you know, pollination of some crops. I mean, insects, you know, a huge lot of the biomass on land is insects, and they have a really incredible role to play in any ecosystem. And we tend to ignore them because they're too small. We think about bees because we know they pollinate some of our crops that we need to have pollinated. But we really need to look after, again, a wider question than just bees. And so, yeah, we can look at what might be affecting the bees and colony collapse and these sort of things, what is going on, and why that's the case. But, you know, we do have frogs in our ponds in our place, but frogs are disappearing all over the place too, you know. And all these creatures have a role in nutrient recycling that's important for the ecosystems. And so, you know, people say, oh, no, we can just put fertilizer on or whatever. It comes back to that same question, you see. Until you get off that sort of bandwagon. And the bees, it's just another one part of the whole issue, really.
Thanks, Gary. We've got just a few minutes left here, so I'd love to finish with asking you both. There's been a question on the chat for a while here around the transition from traditional to regenerative agriculture farming and how you've navigated them. Perhaps we can incorporate that question with the subject of resilience. So I'm thinking it'd be a nice way to finish if you could perhaps give one example each of what would be the first step, or if you could only take one step to make your farm a little bit more regenerative and more resilient, what would be the first thing that you would do? Gary, we'll start with you.
Well, I'll tell you what I did do: plant trees, and then take stock off and allow trees to grow naturally. I mean, trees are great for all sorts of reasons that Greg's touched on as well. And the comment I'd make, though, is it's part of a diversified landscape. And so what type of trees becomes important as well. So it goes back to the question, it depends. But that's certainly what I'd start to do. But I mean, if someone's wanted to do the transition, then yeah, from say, it depends where you're coming from. Whether you're coming from market gardens or whether you're coming from pastoral. But say I take a market gardening one because that's really hard. Then you need an area of grassland, you might say, which is your nutrient source, or margin trees, which is your nutrient source for your veggies that you're growing, because you're taking a lot out of a small area when you're growing veggies, and you need to get nutrients back into it. So if you're not going to do it through artificial fertilizers and have all those sprays, then you need to do it through either managing the grassland and bringing the grasses fertility into the market garden area, which you can sort of do by cut and carry, or use trees in an appropriately sited way that will accumulate, and you've got to check where the water's flowing, where the groundwater's are flowing, and how that happens to get the nutrients to the market garden area. And that's not easy, but that's where you start.
Thank you, Gary. Greg, one thing that you would do?
I think the first thing that you have to do is understand that it is quite a mind shift, and I think the way that you achieve that is probably by going and visiting another farmer that's, you know, already on the regenerative agriculture path. And because generally, you know, I think that is the hardest step to make, because once you've made that step and you open yourself up to the possibilities, you'll find that people that are already on the path, and it is becoming a groundswell at the moment, which is really exciting. And you find that these farmers are really excited about their farming and are really happy to share their experiences, their learnings, their failures, and everything like that. We've got these, you know, amazing groups like Quorum Sense, and I know Taranaki, Northland, Hawke's Bay, we all have our own regenerative agriculture Facebook groups and ways of connecting. And so first and foremost, open yourself up to the possibilities, and then you're on the way.
Yeah, I think with all of this regeneration conversation, the mind shift is going to be the most important and probably the most challenging thing for us all to put in place. Wonderful. Just want to thank you both again for taking the time to be part of this conversation today. It's been wonderful to have you both on here. We have come up to the top of the hour. I wish we had more time to get through some of these magnificent questions, but as I said, we'll try to address them on the social media. Please do join us next week for that regenerative forestry session. I think it's going to be a super exciting conversation with Dame Ann Salmond, who's been doing a lot in space, and Dr. David Hall, who's been producing quite a lot of work for Pure Advantage in this area, along with Ramona Radford as well. Upcoming webisodes beyond that, on the Mondays are Trent Yeo and Dr. Suzanne will be talking regenerative tourism, urban agriculture with Sheldon Levitt, Sarah Smuts-Kennedy, Bailey Perriman and Daniel Sherman. So that's representing people from all over the country working on urban agriculture. And we'll be coming back with a regenerative economy conversation as our final episode. And we haven't yet finalized who those speakers are going to be. So if there's anybody you want to hear again from, please do send through those recommendations. So thank you so much again for joining us, and we will catch you next week. Thanks again to our panelists. Thanks, Gary. Thanks. Ka kite.